Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another Three Nations Dementia Working Group webinar. We're so happy to be with you this morning, and we've got a very interesting panel, a very interesting subject, briefly entitled Walking on Eggshells. And we're going to be examining the relationship between carers, people with a diagnosis, and people that support them. As always, we have a panel to help us with this webinar, and they'll introduce themselves shortly. My name is Nigel. I'm the chair of the Three Nations Working Group, and I will be leaving you shortly. Just to remind you that these webinars rely on you. We need your comments, responses, and questions via the text boxes, which you'll find at the bottom of the screen, that you can use to ask questions. If you raise your hand, unfortunately, we won't be able to see you. The text boxes will be monitored for questions, so we'll be able to respond to some as we go along. I would like to remind you that these webinars are designed, produced, and presented by people living with dementia. These webinars belong to you as much as they do to us. Well, that's all from me, and I'll hand over to Jane, who's known to all of you. I'm sure most of you will know who she is, and I'll let her introduce herself, and she'll be handling the rest of the webinar as chair.
Thanks, Nigel.
Morning, Jane.
And good morning, everybody. Thank you for giving us your time this morning, for taking the time to come and listen to what I'm hoping is going to be a very lively discussion. The more you interact and put things in the chat, the more we'll be able to feedback your questions and have the answers you're looking for. Now, my name is Jane Goodrick, and I live in North Wales with my husband, Chris Roberts, who's here beside me. And he had a diagnosis of mixed dementia, vasculars and Alzheimer's about 10 years ago. So I then developed the label of carer. Now, this month, we'll be discussing walking on eggshells, where we hope to give you an insight into both sides of the dyad, what it's like for people living with a diagnosis of dementia when communicating with their loved ones or with whoever, and also the opposite side of the coin, what it's like for those of us living alongside that diagnosis, those of us with the label of carer. And we have 4 speakers today, so in the interest of time, and to give us more time for those the questions at the end, or if there's a question specific to the person that's speaking, pop it in the chat and we'll ask it as that person finishes speaking. We'll go straight into today's talks, and I'd like to introduce our first speaker. So our first speaker today is Julie Hayden. Julie Hayden is living with a diagnosis of dementia, and she's currently living at a home on her own. Julie, if I can ask you to start, please.
Thank you very much, Jane. Good morning. We're all individuals, and as such have individual reactions to receiving a diagnosis and learning to live with it. I have never felt shame or a need to hide my condition, but I did make a vow to myself on the day I was told I had dementia, that I would not be dragging others down with me. The fact that I didn't have a partner made it easier for me on that score. As I had no daily concern that I was having a negative effect on the life of another. However, I'm still a mother, and my children live far from me. Though even if they were local, ready, willing and able to take on care duties for me, it is my personal choice that I wish to remain a mother rather than for there to be a role reversal. The first difficult conversation between us was in choosing a time and the right words to tell them of my diagnosis. Ideally, I would have been discussing this with them while we were sat in the same room, giving them the chance to ask me questions and for me to reassure them if they had fears that they too might be at risk. However, I knew I had to deliver my diagnosis news over the telephone, and this made it so much harder. I delayed telling them for weeks as I practiced and composed the right words. It's common and recognised for family members to wrap us in cotton wool in order to protect us. What's little recognised is that we do the same thing for those we care about. I think it's amazing when families step forward and out of sheer love dedicate their time, energies, and often compromise their own health to take care of partners, parents, siblings, grandparents. There are many who cannot face that life of changed circumstances and walk away. I understand perfectly, as no one except those with the diagnosis is forced to stick with whatever our journeys have in store. The fact that the majority do stay makes them true heroes in my eyes and worth more than their weight in gold. I have always tried to be honest and open about my own experience of dementia, but I'm wary of letting my children know the full impact for me. Why would I wish to cause them upset or concern? I'm their mum. This has led to misunderstanding between us, as I'm ready to share the positives in my life and the exciting work opportunities I'm involved with, but bulk at talking about the worst times when I find it impossible to leave my home or even achieve any tasks for the day. This led at one point to a blazing row between myself and one of my daughters when she answered back, "Well, Mum, how are we supposed to know you are struggling when all you tell us about is the good stuff?" She had a point. I can't expect my girls to be mind readers. I need to be more mindful of this. But striking that balance is difficult. This aspect of communication is so problematic. For me, an ideal way of exploring these issues and how to deal with them is through peer support. Only someone who has had to walk this fragile path can truly understand, and together we can help each other navigate a much more effective way ahead. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that insight, Julie. I was very taken by what you said about when you made a vow to yourself. When Chris was first diagnosed, I made a vow. My vow was never to lie to him, and it's a topic that's very often brought up. And it hasn't always been as easy as it sounds, but I have managed to maintain that vow to myself. I sometimes have to tell the truth differently to how I would normally, how I might have said something before. I still tell the truth, but in a different way. But what really struck me was how it is so very, very difficult to find that balance between honesty, being honest with our family, and with protecting your family at the same time. And I think you've highlighted that beautifully. So thank you for that. Now, our next speaker is Keith Oliver. He's a person living with dementia. He has a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease and lives at home with his wife, who I like to consider a friend. If you're in the background, Rosemary, hi. Keith, over to you.
Thanks, Jane. Actually, Rosemary's at art today, so she's going to enjoy an art lesson. So I will pass on your regards to her and she'll appreciate that. Thank you. Well, before beginning my personal view on walking on eggshells, I thought I'd Google it this morning. And what I found was an array of books and online advice, none of which I've read, but all about how to manage what can be far from a stroll in the park. Definitions, I guess, add a little to mine or your understanding when they state this: to be overly careful in dealing with a person or a situation because they get angry or offended very easily. To try very hard not to upset someone or something. That's one definition. A second definition is to be careful and sensitive in handling very sensitive matters. So that's what the books say. I actually think walking on eggshells is more than this. For me, I feel everyone should be careful and sensitive for the needs of the other person and of themselves when speaking about or handling difficult or sensitive matters and conversations, and should do this automatically without needing to refer to a book. If one spends time walking on eggshells, then the danger is that you lose your authenticity and your sense of self-worth, and then go on to internalize the other person's issues, their anger and their worries, causing you yourself to become resentful and angry. I wonder how often people listening today in the audience, and thank you for coming along and joining us today, will relate to this. I know there have been times when I have, and I'm sure the same is true of my wife. In any loving relationship, we all seek peace and harmony, and we all try and fix problems, not just for ourselves, but for those we care about. Sometimes this is helpful, but not always. Sometimes our loved one, the person with dementia or the family carer, needs the time and space to sort the issues for themselves, maybe with us watching on tactfully in the background. Putting the needs of the other person first is laudable, but it needs to be done without diminishing too much of one's own well-being, for if you do, then an array of eggshells lie in your path. Sometimes be aware of the triggers which bring out the eggshells and what we can do to avoid treading on them. I know when I'm tired or fall into the trap of talking about concerns before going to sleep, this can cause the problem to arise. It is so hard to wind the clock back or run the video back and replay the scenario or conversation once things are said or done. Also, saying things which can either be misheard or misinterpreted, where the other person thinks they detect a tone in your voice, which is certainly not intended, can cause one to feel vulnerable, upset, and hurt. That is a time when one feels one is walking on eggshells, and it's hard to move away from them. Knowing and caring about the other person, really caring about them, can help avoid the eggshells, but also can at times make this worse, as then one tends to bottle things up and then they can fester and come out later much worse than if spoken about calmly at the time. Jane mentioned wisely earlier about truth after Julie's beautiful talk. Well, from 2014 to 2016, I was part of the Truth Inquiry, which sounds rather like an after apartheid South African investigation, but wasn't. It was based at the Mental Health Foundation, and during this work, I heard many different perspectives on truth-telling in relationships, both personal and professional, relating to late-stage dementia care. Some had the view it was best to tell compassionate lies. Others, like myself, took the view it was far better to tell compassionate truths. This relates closely to today's topic, in that, as Maya Angelou wrote, if you use brutal honesty and brutal truth, the truth is forgotten, but the person does remember the brutality. Empathy, for me, is crucial in avoiding walking on eggshells. Stepping in someone else's shoes to avoid stepping on eggshells, and to see the point from their perspective, as well as, not necessarily instead of, your own viewpoint, is for me very important. During the Truth Inquiry, one of the people we interrogated, for want of a better word, came from Speckle, which was part of the Contented Dementia agenda and book written by Oliver James. Some of you may know that book. I've read it and didn't like it. At the beginning of the book, it makes the statement that the person with dementia is always right. Well, if Rosemary ever read that book, it would go straight in the bin. and probably quite rightly so. I'm not always right, far from it. I have many, 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 many flaws and many, many weaknesses and faults, as indeed do we all. We're not, and none of us are always right. Just to close, before inviting questions, which I'll be delighted to try and answer now or at the end, please, there are no eggshells here. Ask what you feel comfortable in asking. I will be comfortable in answering it. There are times when one feels professionals feel they're walking on eggshells, with me or with other people with dementia. Some GPs almost encourage people to have a sense of denial because the GP may feel there are no support services. They feel there are no treatments. And their only correct view, there is no cure. So they dodge and duck and dive and don't refer the person to the memory clinic or don't give the person a diagnosis. Others refuse to intervene to help support couples who are having a hard time of it, especially in coming to terms with the diagnosis or the dementia as it progresses. My wife and I have experienced all of that. Times when their guidance, compassion, and support are most needed, and where eggshells abound in the relationship at those times. I know from my professional background as an ex-head teacher, and at times peacemaker in relationships, there are ways of avoiding those eggshells. One way to avoid them is, and I'm going to ask James to maybe put this in the chat box, is to consult the fabulous toolkit that's available freely at www.livingwithdementiatoolkit.org.uk. That has the answer to so many eggshells that lie in our path, either as a family carer, a person with dementia, or as a professional. Well, that's enough from me. So I'm going to thank you now. And alongside my friends on the panel, I hope you all will avoid those eggshells. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Chris. Chris, it's because he sat next to me. Keith, very, very well thought out and considered. I was struck by the word you used when you used the word trigger, because that is something that I have great difficulty trying to avoid, those triggers that might create a distressed response for both of us. And when we do have a distressed response, that can go on for hours and hours and hours. So thanks for bringing that word up. Okay, our next speaker is Chris Maddox. So it was my Chris I was referring to just then, Chris Maddox. Now, Chris Maddox is a person living with dementia. She also is from God's own country, Wales, originally, but she's now living in the southeast. Chris has a diagnosis of Lewy body dementia and lives in her own home with her partner. Chris, if we can have your views, please.
Yeah, thank you, and good morning, everybody. And Julie and Keith, brilliant talks, thank you. I haven't got much written down, so I'm going to ad lib, so here we go. I think that walking on eggshells, actually, it was a subject that I thought of because sometimes we walk on eggshells an awful lot. And I've always found I've been quite diplomatic and tried not to break those eggshells, because the shells on an egg are not that sturdy and are not that tough unless you hard boil them first, maybe. And if you break the shell, it releases the inner part of the egg, the white and the yolk, and then they go everywhere. And I think that it's true to say that I've always been quite a level-headed person. I've always been very calm. But these days I find that I get really anxious and get quite wound up. And it's mostly by things that people say and triggers that you can have. And I find now that my anxiety levels are very high. And if I'm anxious, it doesn't take much to set that trigger off. And I think I probably am my own worst enemy. I beat myself up about the things I can no longer do and the things I can no longer get my head around. And I think one of the things that I've had with my partner sometimes is we're having a conversation And we said, I've already told you this, Chris. And no, you haven't. Yes, you have. No, you haven't. And it can go back and forth like that. And we spoke about it. And now I say, if you have told me that, I'm sorry, but I don't remember. And that breaks that bit of tension. And it stops that. I've told you, no, you haven't, etc. So that's one thing that's quite good. And the other thing that, and my partner is listening to this today, but the other thing is sometimes if I'm told, now don't forget to do ABC, and don't forget to do this. And one thing that we've discovered is that if I'm asked to do 3 things, or don't forget to do 3 things, I probably won't remember any of them. But if I'm asked to, just a reminder, can you do this today? And do 1 thing at a time, then I'll do it. And it doesn't tend to wind me up. And one thing that we have used, and it's lapsed a little bit, is a whiteboard. So if there's something I need to do, it's written down on that board. But the other thing to remember is that when we get a dementia diagnosis, it's not just us that gets that diagnosis. It's our partners, it's our family, it's our friends. So it affects such a wider group of people. And very often our partners are forgotten and any attention is put upon ourselves. And I had the privilege, because I have Lewy body dementia, of having some sessions with an Admiral nurse who specialises in Lewy body dementia and is currently working with the Lewy Body Society. And we had sessions on our own, and then we had a partner session. And one of the things that she asked us to do was to answer a question as though we were the other person. So as though I was my caregiver and my caregiver was me. So we answered these questions, and boy, we thought we knew each other really well, but we thought in different ways. And what I thought my partner was thinking wasn't what she was thinking at all, and vice versa. And afterwards we giggled and laughed about it, and it taught us to talk more and to share more. And I sometimes say to my partner, I'm not a mind reader. You've got to tell me how you feel. And I think it's a natural reaction for people to protect you. But as well as protecting us, sometimes they can wrap us a little bit in cotton wool. And I don't want to be treated like an attention seeker or something like that, or, you know, I'm using my emotions to get my own way. And I'm not talking about my situation now, but people sometimes say that. And they say, well, he or she is just using emotional blackmail. And I don't think that's what we intend to do. I think sometimes, and Keith was right in what he said, if I'm tired or if I've got a lot on my mind, my tolerance levels are even lower and my emotion is even higher. And sometimes it doesn't take much for me to just burst into tears. Whereas before dementia, I wouldn't have done that. And I find it's good sometimes if I just take myself, if I'm feeling anxious or that I'm not coping very well, I just take myself off to another room. And I might play a game on the computer, I might do some knitting, and just give myself that bit of time and space. And the other thing that I find, and this is me walking on eggshells, is that I struggle now with loud noises and lots of people. And I feel like I'm the one that's walking on the eggshells because I can't cope very well in those very busy situations. So I will take myself out of those situations if I need to. And I often use distraction techniques as well. So I'll do something to distract me from what's going on that might be raising my anxiety levels. And I think that we should all be sensitive to one another. We should all be kind to one another, whether we have dementia or not. And also I say to people, just to smile, because it costs nothing to smile, but it means an awful lot. And I look at the world today and I think, what is going on? Why can't people just be kind to one another? And then we wouldn't have to sweep up the broken eggshells because they wouldn't have been broken in the first place. And it's so important for us all to say how we feel with our loved ones and what affects us and how it affects us, and to talk about it. And I could go on and say an awful lot more, but yeah, just try not to bake in the eggshells and just look at the other person and see the difference that maybe the dementia is and how dementia is affecting them in their lives, and talk about coping mechanisms and working around things. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that, Chris. You had some very, very good advice in there. And we too have the whiteboard. I think it should come along as a natural part of your diagnosis. When they give you the welcome pack of all the leaflets, they should also give you that whiteboard, because they are so, so useful for everybody. And I was very struck by what you were saying when your partner said, oh, don't forget to do this. And it's a difficulty that we do have, because that's one of our natural, it's the natural vocabulary we use from childhood. Our parent would say, don't forget your coat, don't forget your school bag. And so it's so difficult to change that automatic language that we use to prevent any triggers going off. I've got many comments I can bring up, but we'll bring those in a little bit later. There was a comment in the chat regarding how to talk to somebody in later stages when they're asking about their deceased loved ones. And I know Keith was quite keen to answer that.
Yeah, thanks, Jane, and thanks to the person asking the question. This is something that came up with my mother. My mother had Alzheimer's. So I've experienced Alzheimer's now for more years than I care to think of. And she was in a care home when my father died. And for a long period, on many of the times we visited, she was expecting him to come too. And she'd ask, his name was Lou, she would ask, when's Lou coming to see me? He's not been for ages. And of course, he'd died 4 years before she did. And my answer to that, I really wanted it to be truthful, but I didn't want it to be like the Maya Angelou truth, brutally truthful. So I didn't want her to re-grieve his passing. She was at his funeral, but she got no recall of that, no memory of that. So I didn't want her to have to re-grieve. So my answer to that was not that he was dead, don't you remember? Or he'll be coming later, in which case she would have looked at the clock and worried me and pestered me and worried herself, more importantly, about when he was going to come. My answer was always the same, and it was truthful. And I used this in the truth inquiry. My answer was, he's not coming today. He's not coming today. That was true. The fact that he was never coming again didn't matter. It didn't matter. It made me feel comfortable with the answer, and it certainly made her feel comfortable with the answer. And it was true. So, yeah. And the truth inquiry adopted that. And that was one of the recommendations that it wrote in its report for maybe other people to consider using.
Thanks for that, Keith. And I'm also very struck by some fantastic advice I heard from Dr. Jennifer Butte, who herself is living with dementia in an assisted living facility. And what she says is you tell the truth, and I'm an absolute advocate for this, telling the truth, but it can be difficult. And what she suggested was, instead of saying, oh, you know, the person's died or they might be coming later or whatever, it's ask about the person. So if the person in later stages is asking about their spouse, oh, what was your, for example, what was your husband's name? What work did he do? And to discuss the deceased person without actually answering where they were or something like that. So it's distraction techniques, and you know, it is individual to the person, but this is one of the reasons for these conversations that we're having now, is to actually enhance those communication with people in later stages, because very often I find that Chris's triggers are much more pronounced. My Chris's triggers are much more pronounced in the evening. As Chris Maddox said earlier, when she gets to the evening, she might be more emotional because the triggers are there. And in Chris Maddox's case, you know, she might break down in tears, so distracts herself another way. But with my husband, we don't do that. What I do is try to avoid the triggers. And when it gets really difficult, I actually take myself off to bed. You know, I don't know if that's health and safety, whatever. Actually, I'm going off to bed. It calms us both down, and that's what works for us. So I'm going to go to our last speaker, and last by name, last in the list. Sue, I'll just get my notes up. Sue just lives about 5 miles from me, so I'm thrilled that she's here on this webinar that I'm chairing. Now, Sue cared for her husband who had mixed dementia for 7 years, but recently, very sadly, due to a fall, he is now in a nursing home, and Sue is going to give her viewpoints from the other side of the coin, from the side of the carer. So Sue, over to you. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jane, and thanks to all the previous speakers. Very, very insightful, and makes me feel a little bit inadequate in what I've got to say. But anyway, as I say, John was formally diagnosed 7 years ago. But prior to that, for about 2 years, I knew something was wrong, and I kept sending him to the GP. It's the same story. Many people will have heard this. And so at the time, I thought we were both being honest with each other. I was telling him I thought there was something wrong. He was going to the GP. He was coming back telling me that the GP thought he was fine. But on reflection, maybe he wasn't honest with the GP. I just don't know. Maybe he wasn't telling the GP everything. And you know, he was an academic. He was highly articulate. So I don't really know. But at the time, I blamed the GP. But maybe it was a bit of both. Maybe John wasn't as honest as I thought he might have been. Maybe he thought he was being honest. Anyway, he was finally diagnosed 7 years ago, and he was very honest about it. He would always talk to people. He was happy to talk to people about his diagnosis. Talking to our family was never a problem. We have 3 sons. And it's only in more recent times that I've had to sort of pinch myself and remind myself that actually he is their father as well as my husband. And a lot of the time in caring, I think I've possibly forgotten that. Because there's been so much honesty, I perhaps haven't been, I mean, they're fabulous. They're great. And they give me respite in all sorts of ways. But as I say, hindsight's a wonderful thing. And maybe I should have been a bit more gentle with them at the time. I don't know. Anyway, one of the big things that we walked on eggshells with was driving. He was advised when we had the diagnosis initially, he was advised not to drive. And he accepted that advice for about a week. So that was always difficult, but then he had to take a driving test every 6 months. And I've no idea how he managed to pass it so many times, because he really wasn't safe. And I was always walking on eggshells with that. We got rid of his big car, got him a little car. And the agreement was that he would only drive down to get the newspaper or to go swimming. A total of about, in a day, that might be 15, 20 miles. So I was reducing the amount of time he spent in the car. He could have killed somebody in that time, but legally I couldn't stop him. And so that they were sort of big crunchy eggshells, I think. I remember my eldest son and his wife taking me on one side and saying, you know, you really have to stop him. I said, well, legally I can't. And thankfully the following month he failed his test. And I'm really glad that I didn't stop him driving, because he accepted it through going through a proper test. So we never had that, you know, it's your fault you stopped me driving. But it was a tricky time. Other thing, as I say, it was always very honest, but there were crazy things like post would go missing. And I'd think I haven't heard, you know, I was expecting something and it never arrived. And then I discovered a whole load of post that he had obviously thought was for him, opened it, put it somewhere, completely forgotten about it. And so it came to the point where he didn't accept that he was doing anything wrong or misplacing stuff. So secretly, I just used to go and get the post and deal with it and tell him we hadn't had post for the day, which isn't truthful, but it was a way of dealing with it, and it didn't do any harm. The other thing was telephone. I mean, he was never brilliant with the telephone anyway, but he would take a message, not write anything down, or if he did, I couldn't understand what he'd written down. So again, I used to have to tell people, please don't leave a message with John, because they just don't get through. So if you want to leave a message, either ring again or just leave it on answer phone or something. And again, I really had to tiptoe around all of that because he couldn't take on board the fact that he was not dealing with it properly. And the other thing about telephone, if I was answering the telephone and if I was talking to people for what he seemed was a long time, he'd get really, really cross. And I don't know whether it was because he couldn't process what I was doing, or whether he thought I was talking about him, or whether he was just jealous that I was talking. I've no idea, but that always caused quite a lot of problems. So again, you just take that trigger out of the way and deal with phone calls in a different way. Either ask people to ring at a particular time or not answer the phone or something like that. He'd do the same. Chris alluded, or was it Chris? I think it was Chris alluded to the fact that coping with noise and being in busy places, he definitely had problems there. And this was a man who'd been very, very gregarious and a great networking guy. And suddenly, if we were with a lot of people, he just couldn't cope with that. Sometimes he would just go and sit in a corner, and I knew he was okay, and then had to tell people, unless they knew him really well and could just be with him, don't try and go and talk with him, because he finds that really, really difficult. And I think other people were more uncomfortable seeing him sitting there alone, but he was actually comfortable just observing and trying to get people to understand that that was okay. You don't always have to talk to somebody. You can just be there and say hello and all the usual niceties. But if you're only getting a monosyllabic answer back, just leave it, because actually he was comfortable with that. The other thing, I'm walking on eggshells a little bit at the moment. He was admitted to a nursing home in August, 25th of August, which I was really sad about. I desperately wanted him home, but we couldn't even get the equipment in the house, let alone anything else. And he is in what I consider to be a good nursing home. The care staff, the unqualified staff, are absolutely brilliant, and his basic care is fantastic. He's totally immobile. He can't feed himself. He can virtually not talk. So he has to have everything done for him. And I'm having some difficulty with the qualified staff, the staff that should actually be leading and directing the care staff. We had his continuing care assessment yesterday, and I learnt quite a lot about his care that I didn't know, which sounds ridiculous because I visit him daily. I feed him twice a day. So I am there. There's no excuse that there are certain things that I need to address. And I'd had my suspicions about the qualified staff that I didn't really think they were. Well, I never see them do hands-on care for a start. So how can you really know somebody if you only go out doling out the medicines and things? And I speak, I'm a retired nurse. So, I know what was expected when I was, that was a long time ago. But I shall be taking it up with the manager to say that as far as I'm concerned, carers should be involved with care planning. I'm not a shy, gentle, retiring person that needs protecting. As I say, I'm in there every day, and it needs to be addressed, and it will be addressed. I had already addressed some other issues with them, which we got through. And I think every single person in that home knows my name. But, I think they sort of send a whistle around. Oh God, she's here again. But I'm still caring for my husband, who can do nothing for himself. And communication, as I say, one or two friends have visited him for me when I've been. I took some respite care with my sons, or respite leave, but they're good friends who are very happy to just go in, sit with him, not do anything, talk. He recognizes them, I know, because they tell me he's given them a big smile. And the point of them visiting is really more for my reassurance that he's still okay, because he doesn't communicate. And my way of communicating with him is to go and feed him. I have been feeding him, going in twice a day, but I'm having to reduce it at the moment. But feeding him is my way of communicating with. It helps the staff as well, because the unit he's on, there are 12 residents, none of whom can feed themselves. So, you know, it's a big, heavy, difficult place. But yeah, so the key things from my point of view, I never really had to walk on eggshells in terms of diagnosis, but it was the behaviour, I suppose, following it, that like not letting people get in his face to talk to him, because that would make him really angry. Me being aware that if I spoke to people for too long, that would upset him for some reason or other. Hiding the post, sorting out the telephone, and just being with him. And then, as I say, remembering that my sons are losing their dad as well as me losing my husband. So I think that's probably it.
Thanks so much for that very heartfelt viewpoint, Sue. And I could hear you becoming emotional, and it touched me very much. But I did have the cat climb, the proverbial Zoom cat climbing.
Yeah, well, mine was meowing, and I thought she's going to join in.
That's what made me laugh. Yours was meowing, mine was climbing. You said in the very beginning you felt you are never inadequate. I just wanted to say that. And passing the driving test, I know how he did it. A friend of ours, Paul, who very sadly died a few years ago, he would have to take the test every 6 months, 12 months, and his wife could never understand. Well, he confided in Chris because he was one of Chris's peers. They told him what to do. They told him where to go. They told him when to turn left, when to turn right. So he could very easily drive because he was under instruction. When he was driving alone is when the problems were. So I think that's how he probably passed his test.
Probably, yeah.
And I was very struck by the difficulties you had with the telephone conversations. Chris has admitted to me that when I used to take the phone calls in our office, which was below our bedroom, he would sit and he would listen at the floor to see who I was talking to, what was I discussing, and there was that great jealousy there, which actually he asked me a question this morning regarding, you know, inappropriate behaviour with other people. So that is one of the difficulties we have, that we can't. One of my difficulties, one of my walking on eggshells, is to have a natural conversation with another man can actually be a trigger for Chris. And whilst Chris, my husband, knows there's nothing going on, the dementia will put that little doubt there, and the dementia will start literally pecking away. And these are some of the difficulties. We can't behave in our natural way. I always, my experience is always having this barrier up. Actually, if I behave in my normal way, is that going to be a trigger for Chris? And these are some of the eggshells that I find I'm walking on. And I know Chris Maddox wanted to come in. She had a comment earlier that I missed. So Chris, if you'd like to make your comment now.
Thank you. Yeah, I should have written more down. I just wanted to share 2 examples of walking on eggshells. One was a dear friend of mine who still lives in Wales. She's nearly 80 and she has no family, and we've been friends for 53 years. So she depends on me to do a lot of things. You can't mention the word dementia in front of her. She is in total denial that she has dementia. And I knew she had dementia probably about at least 3 years before she was diagnosed. And it was only when it was discovered that she had breast cancer that she then got a referral to the memory clinic, and she was diagnosed as having Alzheimer's disease. And her short-term memory has gone, but it's no good. And she repeats herself a lot of the time, constantly. And it's no good saying, you've already told me this, you know, don't tell me again, because every time she says something, it's as though she's saying it newly for the first time. And so I find that walking on eggshells with her, because I can't mention the dementia word. I remember when speaking to her milkman, because she hadn't paid the milkman, and I said, if there's any ever problems with paying the bill, if you could get in touch with me, because my friend has dementia. she heard me on the phone and she said, "Don't say I've got dementia. I haven't. Do you think I'm mad?" And the other thing that she had a letter from the DVLA telling her she could no longer drive. And we all know that driving is your independence. And now she says to people, "I've chosen not to drive." She won't say that she's been told she can't drive. So there's ways around wording things and doing things. And the other example I was going to give was my dad. My dad had Alzheimer's disease, so I lived his journey with him before I got my diagnosis. And I just want to say something about hallucinations in dementia, because hallucinations are very real to the person living with dementia. And I'll give you a couple of examples. My dad loved owls, and he had owl ornaments all around the lounge. And one day I went to see him and he said, "Chris, the owls have to come down." So I said, "Why is that, Dad?" He said, "They're all having sex in front of me." Now, I didn't say to him, "Don't be silly, that's not happening." That was real to my dad. So all I did was take the owls down. And we insisted his partner went to visit her sister in Spain because she was a prisoner in the house with my father. And so I had to sleep with him as well. And I did remind him that I was his daughter and not his partner, no cuddles. But he'd wake up in the middle of the night and he was getting dressed in the middle of the night. And I said, "Dad, what are you doing?" He said, "I'm getting dressed." I said, "Well, where are you going?" He said, "I'm going to work. I'm going to catch the bus." It was something like 2 o'clock in the morning. So I didn't say to him, "Dad, you don't work." I said, "Dad," I said, "it's too early for the buses. The buses don't start running yet." So he happily got back into bed and went back off to sleep. So, and it was so important not to tell him that what he thought was real, in fact, wasn't. And I think that's another thing, that we're walking on eggshells, but don't break that person's, don't break their heart really by telling them that it's not real. And the same with bereavements. You know, my grandmother had dementia and her daughter died, and we never told my grandmother that her daughter had died because she didn't understand it. So I think I've said enough, Jane. Thank you.
No, thanks for those insights. I think we can now actually unmute ourselves and maybe have a discussion. There are some things in the chat. Somebody's put a very important point to say that it's extremely important to remember that dementia is as individual as the person. And I think we've been hearing that today. What works for one won't work for another. But it's very important that we find out what works for the person. Chris, you wanted to speak?
There's somebody, a lady called Jean has put in the Q&A. Is it healthy to do what I'm doing now? I'm trying to make a difference for people. After my dad's death in 2010, I made so many mistakes.
Well, I'll jump in with that. Yes, it is healthy what you're doing now. We all make mistakes. We're here discussing how we try to communicate without walking on eggshells, but we're making mistakes all the time. This is something that you literally learn on the job. The very first talk I gave, I said, this is a job I've been given that I didn't apply for. I have no training for. I have no clue what I'm doing, and it's not a job I would employ me for. But what else can we do? We just have to be aware of those mistakes and try to correct them in the next circumstance. The last thing we need to do is beat ourselves up. And this is one of the difficulties that carers do have, this carer guilt. There can be carer guilt for putting our loved one into a care home. There can be carer guilt because we didn't get it right. There can be carer guilt because actually we don't want to care. Now, it is a choice when we do our caring, and we choose to do it. We might not like it, but it is still a choice that we make. And we have to be gentle with ourselves. You know, any mistakes that I made in any aspect of my life, I didn't know better at the time. Now I know better, I can try to do better. So I hope that addresses some of the potential emotions you may be feeling. Chris?
There's one other question from Damien Murphy. How the presence of a dementia affects and sets traps within relationships is massive and universal. For example, we need to prevent this bottling up and festering that Keith had mentioned, and all the eggshell moments. How can we get to the point where practical support is offered to address relationships around the time of diagnosis? Now, that is a huge question.
Keith,
Keith,
you want to take it?
I'll start and then hand over to my friends on the panel. I think this is where sometimes the Admiral Nurse model is an interesting thing to look at, because it operates in different ways. And we know that there are not enough Admiral Nurses. I think they're now approaching 400 across the country, which compared to when Jane and I were banging the drum some years ago, when they were looking to try and reach 200, is good. But the 4,000 Macmillan nurses, it then puts it into context. So I think the Admiral Nurse model is interesting, because they sometimes will support the carer to support the person with dementia. That's one model, and for some people that works. In other cases, they can support the couple. And I think sometimes it's the couple who need the support, possibly more so than supporting one side of the couple. That would be my approach to Damien's really good answer there. There are people out there, not enough of them. There are also family therapists who can help. They sometimes help people in avoiding walking on eggshells and dealing with issues. But certainly the Admiral Nurse. GPs don't tend to touch that sort of stuff very helpfully these days, because there's no pill to solution.
Well, my opinion is this should be addressed in the memory assessment services.
Yeah.
When we're going through diagnosis. We have a psychologist to do the testing, to test Chris's abilities in all the different domains. Why can't they give us counselling beforehand to prepare us for a diagnosis, counselling afterwards for any grief or the problems there, and that ongoing counselling work? The Admiral Nurses are fantastic, but again, it's a postcode lottery. And Julie, I noticed you had an I want to speak up a few minutes ago. Do you still?
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on the subject you were speaking about, Jane, with regards to guilt that we can all feel. Both my parents had dementia, and the guilt of particularly, I mean, my dad knew about his dementia. My mum was very much in denial, and so that led to some very tricky situations with her, of not being able to speak about her dementia. And I think that the whole thing about we're human and we have to be kind to ourselves, and the fact that the emotions that come into play when you're trying to support someone who's got dementia. There were times when I would be so upset because my mum would be in denial, and she'd be she'd be saying one thing to the doctors which were blatantly untrue, and I would be so frustrated because they would be accepting her word for what was happening, and that I would get really frustrated with her and lose my temper with her. And then afterwards, when I lost my mum, continually beating myself up for those times when I lost my temper with her. But I think kindness all the way, of just accepting we're all human, we'll all make mistakes, and that we have to allow for each other to have those emotions. We have a right to those emotions, and that it's very important that we have some kind of format where we can allow those emotions to come out, expression of those emotions, and not feel guilty for having them.
Absolutely, fully agree, Julie. Emotions not expressed just go inside, and as Keith said earlier, they go inside and fester. Chris Norris has also put a very good point in the chat. Chris Norris is a person living with dementia in Kent. My Chris says the same thing. The guilt that they have for having dementia and what that does to the family is something that, again, that brings us back to the topic. That is walking on eggshells, the guilt that they feel for what they're doing to us. I know my Chris tries to, not to hide things, but tries to play things down, tries to underplay stuff, that actually he needs to express it and let it out. As Julie was saying, we need to express these emotions, and as a nation or as a race, we're very inept at doing that. I've learned to cry a lot, and do you know what? Crying's really good. If anybody has any questions, last minute questions, can you please put them in the chat? Or if any of my panel have any last minute comments, I know we're running short of time, but yeah, if anybody wants to have a last comment. So Chris, over to you. You're on mute.
A message from Heather. Guilt is like that monster under the bed. It lurks in the dark and pops out, scaring us terribly. Might be helpful to put it in the light and talk openly with your loved one about the effects it has on you.
I absolutely fully agree. And Chris has just said, yeah, that's exactly how he feels too. So thank you very much for that, Heather. Keith, do you have any last minute word you'd like to say before we start winding things down?
Sorry, I had to just turn my camera off for a moment. And it was Power was ringing me about my wife's horrendous stay in hospital recently, which maybe sets up Nigel to speak about something coming up. But thank you everyone for joining us this morning. That was a really great webinar and I'm proud to be part of it. Thank you.
No, it's been wonderful. It's been quite eye-opening for me too. The way everything you've all discussed, it seems to be universal, although it manifests in different ways. Universal to the people with dementia, but also those of us that have the label of carer. There was somebody in the chat said, it was a gentleman who I believe has dementia, that actually we should just come out with it and say things. That isn't always a solution that would work in my case. It might work in his case, but certainly if I am not mindful about the way I address a topic or address a topic, then that can create a difficulty at home, which impacts on Chris, that impacts on me, and then we both go into a downward spiral. Because I made a vow to myself that I would always tell Chris the truth, and I'm sticking to that in whichever way I can. It's been a wonderful chatting with you all. I made lots and lots of notes. There were various questions I was going to bring up, but they've all gone. And yeah, one of the big thing about eggshells is avoiding those situations that for my Chris, the noise we were talking about earlier when we go into social situations, Chris's stock answer is no, I'm not going. Well, actually, I need a social life. I need an active life as well. And once we get to places, Chris is actually fine, but we're mindful we take him to the quieter side of the room, or Chris sits with his back to the room because there's less noise coming there. But there are two of us in this relationship. There's two of us in this diagnosis. We do have to be mindful of each other. Chris and I try to communicate as much as possible, but sometimes we do have to be a little bit discreet. You know, as Sue was saying, have we had any letters today? She might have been a little bit discreet about the letters that did come. Chris just hands all our letters over to me now, and that works for us. So thank you all very, very much for being here. The recording will be available. I don't know how long it takes to get up on the website. Maybe Nigel can tell us that. And thank you all for being here, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Jane, and my thanks to the panelists. You've been absolutely brilliant. It's a unique experience to sit and listen as a member of the audience and to track the reactions, but fabulous stuff. Thank you so much. And thanks to the participants as well. We're now touching 90,000 people who've attended these webinars since April 2020, I should say. So that's fantastic. Just to remind you, our next webinar is a fortnight today, and it's on a subject which is close to everyone's heart, which is hospital care. And we've got some fairly unique contributions. So thank you very much. Thank you, Jane. Many thanks. Thank you, panelists. Brilliant. A really good webinar. Enjoyed, I think, from the reactions in the audience. So goodbye, everybody. So if you could log off, except for the panelists. And thank you so much. We see you on the 29th, hopefully. Bye-bye.
Bye.